Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jordan Buck. I'm a liveryman of the Worshipful Company of International Bankers. I also chair its events committee and sit as a court assistant. Welcome to those members and to those that aren't members. I just wanted to spend 30 seconds on what the Worshipful Company of International Bankers is. For those that don't know, we are one of 110 livery companies in the City of London. It's an ancient tradition that goes back hundreds of years. We're open to members all over the financial services industry, and our core aim is one that is charitable, but also we seek to have community amongst our fellow professionals. So I want to welcome today our two speakers that have kindly dialed in to share their thoughts. We have Richard Byrne, Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for Europe, formerly Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for China, and Professor John Ryan, who's a fellow at LSE Ideas at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a network research fellow at CESINFO in Munich, and also a liveryman. So today, each are just going to spend 10 to 15 minutes sharing their thoughts in general on global trade negotiation. Professor John Ryan, would you share your thoughts with our audience?
Yes. What I'll do is I'll share a view that doing a trade deal with the EU, US, and China is going to be very unclear what's going to happen in the future. So we've seen over since 2016 different calculations of how much damage Brexit has already done. It's a reality. We're going to go through with it. This was Bloomberg Economics kind of assessment, which probably is quite a large amount of money there in terms of 2 billion 10 by 2020. Now, Standard & Poor's did a similar exercise and came with a lower figure than that. But what is not in question is that it has cost the UK economy since 2016 tens of billions. And now on top of that, we've got a situation with COVID-19 where the UK economy is going to find it very difficult to move forward. Just some facts, I suppose. Large trading partners of the UK, obviously the European Union has been a very important trading partner, the United States, and you can see China down there as well. And you can see also that most of the European countries that we were doing trade with, well, we're still doing trade with at the moment, but we won't have a trade deal at the moment, it looks like, because we may be going out on no deal, which would be very, very difficult. But these largest trading partners of the United Kingdom, it's going to be very hard to replace those numbers by other incidental deals. So the China trade deal, this was looking quite an interesting deal, I suppose, because of the Cameron years and the time with having China as a valued partner. But I think things have changed quite dramatically. Obviously, US-China trade difficulties at the moment, geopolitical issues about the South China Sea, issues about how dependent supply chains have become, especially now with COVID-19, have become dependent on China. Plus, we've had the issue of the new security law and what was happening with Hong Kong. And the governing party at the moment had, obviously during the Brexit time, had the European Research Group, but also now has a China research group, which is looking at a more critical approach to what we would do with China. And that has rather soured the relationship. At the same time, the EU is starting to take a much more stronger stance against China. So the trade deal between the EU and China is not happening at the moment. So, you know, you look at this graph and it shows major supplier, geopolitical rival. You know, it's a major market, of course it is, but how are we going to navigate that with China? The City of London will still be attractive for China as an offshore RMB centre in Europe for the time being. But as I mentioned, we've got a whole host of challenges facing London's relations with China, such as Hong Kong, mobile technology, nuclear power station, etc., etc. And China's investments have been mostly financial and in real estate. And so they were in a situation where they could move out quite more easily than maybe some of the countries that have got manufacturing commitments in the UK. Maybe that will take them longer if they choose to do that. And Brexit could make UK less important to Chinese firms. Many of their Chinese companies have set up HQs here in London and elsewhere. And that may change after we leave the European Union. So we come to the other deal, and I'm sort of frankly amazed, really, that everyone's just come onto this issue of what was happening in Congress and what Biden was saying and what Pelosi was saying, because they were saying this quite a long way back since 2016. Especially 2 years ago. I mean, Pelosi was here at the LSE talking about this issue, and Biden on the campaign trail during the primaries was talking about this issue, and Congress passed a resolution, I think in November, where they said that there would be no deal if the Good Friday Agreement / Belfast Agreement was in question. And if we want to, you know, people have been writing about this in the last 5 to 7 days in the Daily Telegraph and in various blogs. I mean, in the end of the day, Mick Mulvaney, who was the interim chief of staff to President Trump, has also said that he warned against a hard border by accident on the island of Ireland. And he said the Trump administration's State Department and US Congress would be an aligned desire to see the Good Friday Agreement / Belfast Agreement preserved, to see a lack of a border maintained. So there's real questions over that. So if you know, Joe Biden becomes president, and of course this quote at the bottom has been a quote from his tweet, where he made it very clear we can't allow the Good Friday Agreement that brought peace to Northern Ireland to become a casualty of Brexit. And any trade deal between the US and UK may be contingent upon respect for the agreement and preventing a return of a hard border period. And this is politics as well as his own personal Irish-American background, but, you know, 10% of Americans are of Irish-American descent. And, you know, when you look at the Trump administration, there's been quite a lot of Irish-Americans in that. So basically, I think there's a real problem with this deal. And frankly, there's been no real movement besides the ambassador from of the United States to London, who is in this process irrelevant, because you know, he's not going to be the decision maker on any trade deal. So he might be saying things in the background there about, well, you know, we will certainly do a deal. It's not really up to him. And I think McIlvanney speaks more for what the Trump administration is about than the ambassador. And of course, this is going to have a hit on the European Union, this situation that we might have a no deal, because the United Kingdom is a valid partner and is, from a financial perspective, it's going to be a hit for the EU. But there's the lack of knowledge of Europe, and especially the lack of knowledge about Germany in British political life, British media, and people who are talking about these things is amazing. The idea a few years ago that the German car companies would intervene on behalf of the United Kingdom, because UK is a very important market for them, that they could influence Angela Merkel, was really misreading the situation very, very badly. This was never going to be the case, and it's been kind of amazing to look at the European Union more or less standing together on these issues. Options for trade between the UK and EU. This was a graph that was put up, and there were different options, and I was doing this in 2016 onwards in terms of consultancy. I mean, in one of these other scenarios last year is that there might not be Brexit because it was very touch and go in the Parliament at some stage. So there might be a second referendum. But when you look at these different options, there are UK red lines. And I feel, and I think that when you talk to people and listen to people in the EU, that having their cake and eating it is still in the mind of some people in the government, and that they feel that they can still have the benefits of EU membership without compromising. And I think that that's going to be a difficult one to get over. And anyway, even if we come to a point where there might be a reversal of this situation at the moment, if the deal that will be done will be so thin that it'll be, you know, negligible to a certain extent, how much that will be able to move forward. I feel that at some stage after we've left, properly left, on January the 1st to 2021, we'll have to, you know, come back and approach this issue all over again. And this is something that the EU, I think Barnier's team is known as Mr. PowerPoint, and there was books about death of distance. I mean, the idea that, you know, you can have a Canada deal on the same terms with a country that's right on the doorstep, has been integrated within the European Union for over 40 years. Obviously, we have to understand, and I think it's very difficult for some people to understand that the EU are going to protect the single market, and they're going to make sure that they're not going to give away anything without a proper negotiation, because that would send a bad signal to the rest of the world, especially China and the United States and other countries, that you know, they have their concerns and their negotiating positions as well. So thank you very much. Hopefully I've kept to time, and I shall hand over to the chair.
Thank you, John. Fantastic. Richard, would you share your thoughts with the audience, please?
Jordan, yes, thank you very much. As Jordan explained, I am the Trade Commissioner for Europe, working for the Department of International Trade. So I am an official, and I can only, my job is to implement government policy in relation to trade in Europe as I'm instructed. So I don't have the liberty that John has to comment so freely on some of the government's positions, but I can tell you what we are trying to do and what the Secretary of State's goals are. I mean, my job is to promote British exports to Europe and to encourage inward investment to Europe, and as part of the, to encourage inward investment from Europe into the UK. And as part of the work we do on exports, we have a very busy market access agenda to try and remove some of the barriers to our exporters. They aren't the sort of huge barriers you face in China, such as, you know, access for British beef or the ability to trade in oil and gas. But you'd be surprised to hear that, in fact, DIT has logged more market access barriers in Europe on our internal data system than we did for China. They tend to be very micro barriers to do with government procurement, additional licensing conditions that European member states have imposed on top of the EU law, and all sorts of other registration requirements that just make it difficult for even other member states to get access to the markets. So that is a huge priority for us. I mean, clearly our relationship with Europe is going to continue to be important after we've left the transition period at the end of the year. I think I saw John's figures on our trading partners. I mean, the pattern is right, but I think the figures are slightly outdated. Our trade with Europe is now 53% of our total trade. China is our third biggest trading partner after the EU and the EUS, and our bilateral trade with China is now 90 billion. It's gone up from 70 billion in the chart. And if you throw in Hong Kong, it's 104 billion. So it's a massive trading partner. I spent the last 3 years until my appointment as Europe Trade Commissioner, as Trade Commissioner for China, and we made very significant progress, I think, in terms of pushing the China-UK trade agenda. Liam Fox, as Secretary of State, was extremely engaged. He made 5 visits to China during his time as Secretary of State, as many visits there as he did to the US, with which he had long-established connections. He held a joint economic and trade committee with Minister Zhongshan, the MOFCOM minister, who was his counterpart, and we did achieve market access in quite a number of areas, most significantly for food and drink, beef being the big one, but also pork. We made progress on poultry and seafood. We gained access for retail petrol stations, and we made significant progress on financial services, not only with licenses for the 2 big banks present in China, HSBC and Standard Chartered, but also for insurance and asset management. Although the US has been much more aggressive in terms of pushing openings, and its own companies have been more aggressive than our companies. There is a $1 trillion domestic market, multi-trillion dollar domestic market for asset management in China, if that can be cracked open. Of course, the issue we all face with China is that the relationship has soured significantly, particularly following the US-China trade war, the action that the US took against Huawei, the decision the government made on Huawei, reversing to some extent its decision earlier in the year to allow Huawei access to the markets. And clearly the overall atmosphere on China has become more complicated, and that I suspect will slow our ability to make further quick progress. But before I left my job in China at the end of last year, Liz Truss was keen to have a joint economic trade committee with Zhongshan and follow up on the one Dr. Fox had in 2018. But I'm afraid, it's fallen by the wayside thanks to COVID. And I suspect the larger China-UK political issues, and then now, of course, the priorities around trade agreements. Of course, you can argue about the size and value of the trade agreements, but the department is prioritizing trade agreements with the US, Japan, which has just been signed, Australia and New Zealand. And I think the Secretary of State is particularly keen on the trade agreement with Japan and then Australia, because she sees it as a sort of foothold into applying to join the CPTPP. That's the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which includes all the countries, most of the countries around the Pacific, in Latin America, as well as in Asia Pac. And that market is, actually about the size of the EU, although from the convenience and ease of trade and the distance issues, of course, I realize that it's not the same. There will be a second round of FTAs after that, which the government is now looking at. They have made no announcement, so I can't really speculate, but you would expect it. To be some of the large BRIC countries where there is a significant opportunity for UK exporters. But I still think that China is a big opportunity, and that business needs to continue to make the case for engagement with China, particularly on the financial services side, where I always thought there was the biggest opportunities for our businesses. As for the EU FTA negotiations, I don't know much more about what's happening there than you do. We see it in the press. The negotiating strategy is held very tightly between David Frost and his team at Number 10 and the Department of Trade in general. is not involved. But I do know that the Prime Minister remains committed to getting a trade agreement, an FTA, with Europe. And although some people say there isn't time to get anything other than a very thin agreement, even if we got an agreement that abolished all tariffs and quotas between us, that would nevertheless be a step forward. I think probably we will get an agreement despite all the difficulties that seem to be facing us now, simply because it's in both sides' interests that we do. But I can't speculate beyond that, and I've no idea what the shape of any agreement might be. But again, the Prime Minister remains committed to building up our trade with Europe. I mean, how can we not when it's 53% of our trade? And Germany, of course, is a huge partner. Germany is our biggest partner, and then France and the Netherlands come pretty close behind. But we see opportunities all over Europe, including, interestingly enough, I've just been on a call with all the ambassadors to the West Balkans. That is, if I can remember all the countries, that's Serbia, Kosovo, Albania, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Again, you're only looking at £1 billion worth of trade, but that region is growing faster than almost anywhere else. And if we can get a bit of DIT resource in there, if we can conclude the continuity agreements, which we're negotiating with 4 of those countries, which are among the few outstanding ones in Europe that we haven't signed, then again, we can make progress. So I see my job as intervening where we can make the most impact for the sectors which will drive the UK economy in the future. So we're working much more closely with BEIS to identify the big bet sectors. Many of those were laid out in the industrial strategy, but that is obviously being refined. But I think positively for our department, we are now working much more closely with BEIS to internationalize the industrial strategy. So we will be looking at what are the sectors which provide the greatest opportunity for our businesses, and then for me in Europe, which are the countries and regions where we can, whether there is the biggest opportunity in terms of partnerships for the British companies, and what can we do as a government department to help open up the markets, particularly around things like barriers and engaging our partner governments to support us. So that's a bit about my role and a bit of background. I'm very happy to take questions on anything to do with China or Europe, but as I've said, I can't comment on specific trade negotiations.
Thank you, Richard. So we'll go to Q&A now. So please put any questions you have in that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And I would like to start with one, if I may. I was wondering about tech and big tech. We've seen recently that the EU are trying to gain more powers against US-dominated big tech in Europe. We've also seen a similar thing in US and China with banning of TikTok, WeChat, and previously Huawei. Do the countries really see that as a threat in terms of security or charging more tax or protection of their industries? Or is that really just a bargaining chip for global trade negotiation? I'd be interested to get your thoughts on that.
Well, it's difficult to know. I think it's a mixture of both. I mean, the American, if you look at the Commerce Department statement banning WeChat over the weekend, they say that the Chinese are maliciously stealing the data of American consumers and sharing them with the Communist Party. I mean, we haven't seen the evidence for that. President Trump has given different reasons for taking action against China at different times, so it's difficult to know what the real reason is. I mean, I suspect that it's largely political, and that the Commerce Department is scrambling to find an answer, but to find the evidence. But there's no doubt that the security agencies in the States, when you saw the head of the FBI come out with a very damning report about what China was doing in multiple ways that were damaging to US security. So who knows? I don't really think we've seen the evidence on WeChat, but I think there is genuine security concern. But the extent to which these decisions made by President Trump are based on security concerns or politics are anybody's guess.
Thank you. Next question to come in is about proximity. So going back to that Barnier slide that John, you showed earlier.
Yep.
Why, after 45 years of EU integration, do we as the UK still sell much more to the US without a trade agreement than we do to Germany, France, Netherlands, by a large margin.
I think that says a lot. I mean, there was a few things with that, just to say that, there's a time lag in data, and I think 53% to the EU was mentioned by Richard. That's because Germany's exports to the United Kingdom has actually gone down. Ireland's exports to the United Kingdom has gone down, and other countries' exports to the United Kingdom. So when you put exports and imports together, yes, I think the amount of trade now with the EU is starting on the slide, and you see that with the Irish Republic since the 1960s. Its dependency on the United Kingdom has become much less, and it'll become even more telling in the next, if there's no deal, even more telling in the not too distant future, as they look for other ways of having a bridge into Europe, and that will probably go from Dublin, Cork into Le Havre rather than go over the Holyhead route. But at the moment, they're just hoping that would work. In terms of that other question, it's a lot to do with what do the Germans, French, and Netherlands want to buy from the United Kingdom? And is Britain really a trading nation in those goods? And are they more liable to be doing trade in other areas, financial services, for example? So I think that in Germany, France, and Germany, France, and the Netherlands, and you add those up against the United States, then it's down to whether we are able to export and get an export markets and get people to buy our goods. And they are in the United States. It's interesting to know what's the breakdown of that export performance to the United States. Is it more service-based rather than in terms of goods?
Thank you. There's a question now about the climate agenda, and how much that plays into how important that is within trade negotiations. Question for both of you.
I think the climate agenda is certainly very important to the British government. I mean, Boris Johnson and the Foreign Secretary have made it very clear that it's at the top of our agenda, and all ambassadors have been asked to sort of report on what they're doing to support the climate agenda. As you know, we're going to be co-chairing with the Italians COP26 next year. And so we want to see significant progress on climate change issues. When I was in Beijing, we were certainly engaging China in the hope that they would work with us on climate change issues, particularly as the US has sort of rather given up its leadership on this, with Trump pulling out of the Paris Accord. The extent to which it actually affects trade negotiations, I'm less clear. I think it rather depends who you're negotiating with. I don't think it's been a factor in the US trade discussions so far, because I think the US is very reluctant to involve these aspects. I suspect it is more of an issue in Australia and New Zealand discussions. But I'm not sure what specific issues around climate change will be forced in these negotiations, therefore what could become problematic if a negotiation got difficult. So it's definitely at the forefront of our mind, but I don't have any examples of specific climate change issues that become an issue in discussions. Of course, don't forget, what we're trying to do with most of the negotiations is basically grandfather the EU negotiations. So, for example, the one with Japan, it was basically everything that the EU got, plus we got a bit more on financial services access, a bit more on agri-food quotas, and then we had to give a bit of ground on car imports, I think. But the basis for discussion was the existing EU-Japan FTA. So I don't think we raised any new issues based on climate change issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that this is a massive issue now. When you see it around the world, and you see Australia, you see the west coast of the United States, you see the Arctic Circle, what's happening there. So this is a massive issue, along for the United Kingdom Brexit implications, but especially with COVID-19 on there as well. I think you need a very well managed, a well-informed bureaucracy and political elite in different countries that are managing this. And unfortunately, what we see around the world is quite a few countries don't have the administrative or the political wherewithal to actually deal with these subjects. Very, very complex, very, very difficult contingency planning on these things. But, you know, climate change is there, it's for everyone to see. And obviously there are people who are denying that, as they are denying and have denied that COVID-19 is a serious risk for people's health, but also for the economy and how that's managed. I think will be something that moves forward and has and will have effects on elections and people's perceptions of politicians and the way their governments conduct themselves.
A question now directed at Richard, really about the odds of a no-deal Brexit. So, what are the chances of that, and how do you handicap that possibility? If you're allowed to comment.
I mean, I really shouldn't comment on that. Obviously, it's a possibility, but the government has said that it is very determined to get a deal and still wants to get a deal. So I can't give you odds.
Can I comment on that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So for a long time, I've been at one stage an outlier on the no deal. But if you see it now, I think there's a high probability of a no deal Brexit for various reasons, because number one, your main negotiating partners have serious issues about the trust and how much, when someone engages themselves in a withdrawal agreement, actually presents that to Parliament, presents that to the electorate, gets elected saying we've got an oven-ready deal. This is then signed off by the new Parliament in 2020, in actual fact. And then further down the line, they say, oh, well, hold on a minute, we're not really sure about this. We've signed it, but yes, we're going to break the law and not adhere to that. So I think that that is a massive issue that needs to be addressed. And how we address that in the next few weeks is going to be extremely difficult. But the trust of our European partners in this situation is one thing. The internal dynamics of the Conservative Party, which have taken on quite a lot of a UKIP Brexit party type of ideology with this, is for a no deal. That's what they've always said. Just read what these people have said for a very long time. And maybe this is lost in the ether because 80% of the papers are not really covering this maybe enough on the media itself, because the people don't seem to be that informed about it. And they're willing to go ahead with this. I mean, everyone knows that Brexit's going to happen, but a no-deal Brexit, which was never supposed to happen, and we can bring up many interviews and written articles that this was not going to happen. And the idea now that you know, we're hurtling towards that, and that will have a lot. I've noticed another question there to all panelists about an equivalence regime. That's going to be very difficult. I think that in the process of this, in terms of maybe if we have a no deal, how we deal with these issues to do with the financial services community is going to be very interesting. I mean, the Bank of England and the ECB have been working on certain issues, and of course clearing has been put forward to 2022, I think. But some other issues in terms of asset management, and again, the EU will try and leverage that. So a no deal is going to have a really, really bad effect on all of the economy. It's going to be another hit on top of maybe another COVID second wave. So I think that's something we need to desperately avoid at all costs. And, you know, a thin deal is better than no deal. But at the moment, where are we going to get that deal from when trust has been not only damaged from a UK EU perspective. But China turns around and says, well, you're talking about Hong Kong and look at what you're doing with the EU. And the United States, as we know from all these comments that are coming from the United States, they are saying the same thing. And no deal will also mean the Good Friday / Belfast Agreement will be in question because there will be a hard border. Now, if anyone doesn't understand that, I will gladly explain why that will happen.
Please do, John.
Right. So when the Good Friday Agreement and the Belfast Agreement, Belfast Agreement was introduced, the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland were in the EU. So the main objective of this was to come to a conclusion and try weapons out of Northern Ireland and the killing out of Northern Ireland, but also actually to make it a situation where the border was not going to be an issue anymore. And while there were members of the European Union, that was possible. That's why the European Union somehow was involved, despite the claims of many correspondents in papers. The EU has something in this issue as well. And we have to remember that the Irish Republic in 2016 under Enda Kenny made sure this was an issue straight off the bat when the referendum happened, and went to the EU and said, we need to be very careful here about the border in Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement, Belfast Agreement, and the single market, the legitimacy of the single market. Because if there's an third-party country outside, then we need to make sure that legitimately. So that for Germany, France, all the other countries is very important, the single market. And for the United States, it was an American diplomat that actually hosted this. Tony Blair and President Clinton were involved with the Irish Republic government and the EU in the background. So it comes down to what the British would talk about, sovereignty. But also the issue is there needs to be a border somewhere, right? Because once you're out of the EU, you need to have a border there. And so we've had this with the backstop, we've had this with the withdrawal agreement. And it'd be interesting because there was supposedly from people who claim to be trade specialists, who may not be trade specialists, about electronic solutions that were never never really proven, and still haven't been proven, that could overcome this issue. So I think that is the no deal issue is really, really a crucial one. And financial services might be able to deal with it, but quite a lot of SMEs and other companies still haven't reacted because they have no certainty. And so the haulage industry has been lobbying, and others, to see whether this can be overcome. So I think that, a no-deal Brexit is what's the percentage likelihood? That's very difficult to put a figure on, because it could be anything from up to 60% maybe. And we're hoping on that 40% that there's a thin deal somewhere to be made to try and get over some of the issues that we need to get over. Because on the 1st of January 2021, it's a bank holiday. On the 2nd of January 2021, that's when things start going seriously awry at borders and at Dover, etc. So we're going to have a very interesting ride here, and it's one I think most people would want to avoid, because the damage to the economy and supplies is all well known. So a no deal is something we need to really avoid, and people need to focus their minds on that and not play politics with this, because this is people's lives and livelihoods.
A question now on the World Trade Organization. Is it finished, or is there enough of willingness to reform it? Question for both of you, please.
Well, I think there is enough of a willingness to reform it, but it clearly does need reform, and it needs strong leadership. I mean, I'm not going to make a pitch for Liam Fox's candidacy, but obviously as our former Secretary of State, we have been responsible for supporting his campaign. and he's done quite well in that he got through the first round, despite the fact that the overwhelmingly favoured candidates are the two female African candidates, both of whom have distinguished credentials. But I think that Dr. Fox has got as far as he has because he has gone around the world meeting people and saying very clearly that we need to get the WTO back on track. Trade has lifted billions of people out of poverty over the last 40 or 50 years. And the purpose of the WTO obviously is to regulate trade at a global level so that all countries are treated fairly, and particularly that small, less developed countries, maybe landlocked countries, are able to trade on fair terms with the rest of the world. He also sees trade as a means of empowering women and has made several commitments around that in his candidacy, all of which is agreed by all the other candidates. Huge opportunities for SMEs if we can open up trade, opportunities for developing countries and poorer people. The question is there a political willingness to get the WTO working again? I think there is clearly from the developed countries who all want to be able to benefit from proper global trade rules. And so it's really down to the large countries. It seems that there's a willingness now amongst the large countries. They've all been very engaged and very supportive of this WTO process, and they all want a capable person to come out as the new Director General who can pull things back together. But absolutely critical to doing that will be somehow reconciling the trade differences between China and the US and making sure that they don't collide again at the WTO and stop the WTO from working. And the immediate problem that needs to be resolved is the appeals panel, which is now unable to function because the US has refused to appoint members to this appellate board. So the US has got to be persuaded to re-engage and to start reappointing people again so that there can be a process for judging when countries think they've been unfairly treated. I don't know obviously who is going to become the DG and what their priorities will be, but surely getting that appellate board working again has to be one of the top ones. Now, the US claims that they don't support the appellate board, although I think they've won more cases than they've lost. They have lost a few high-profile cases, and they claim that the appellate board has overreached in that instead of simply interpreting the existing rules as agreed within the WTO, they have created new areas of precedent where they've effectively created their own rules or made decisions which create new situations that were never supported by all the other WTO members. The Americans take a particularly strong view on this. I think several other countries would agree the appellate board has perhaps gone a bit further than its originally envisaged remit. But I think the way to solve that problem is for a DG to get the big countries together and come up with proposals for the reform of the appellate board that will satisfy all countries. I mean, of course, China is now positioning itself as, oh, well, we support the WTO, we're in favour of the rules-based international system. It's only the US who is being totally unreasonable. But of course, China, I think they joined the WTO in 2001. I mean, there are many commitments that they have not lived up to. And then there's now the issue which has been sort of flagged, I suppose, by Trump initially, but picked up on by European governments, that because so many of their industries are state-owned and therefore have privileged access to state banking and government support, much of their industry is in an unfair position compared to us. And this is not captured properly by the WTO. There's a requirement under WTO rules that countries are supposed to notify the WTO if they subsidize industries. But it was never envisaged that a country, 50% of whose industry was in fact state-owned, would be in the WTO when that notification rule was written. So China hasn't really taken much notice of it. They've recently committed to follow up and do a bit more notifying, but that doesn't really solve the problem. The fact is that when the GATT and the WTO was formed, it was never envisaged that a communist state the size of China with a totally centralized state-owned system would ever be a WTO member. So the WTO needs reform. And they need to address the appellate board first, and somebody needs to be able to knock the heads together of the big countries so that we can make progress. But if these issues can be overcome, I think all countries recognise that the WTO plays a very important role. But we haven't had any progress since Doha stalled. We've seen more and more plurilateral agreements and bilateral agreements in the absence of multilateral agreements. So there is a bit of a question mark out there as whether the WTO can get back to doing what it should. But I'm optimistic that under new leadership, it will be able to make progress.
It's certainly something that's needed. I think Richard's pointed out that it's down to China and the United States, and both of them have their problems. And I read that it's Trump, and of course it's Trump, and they didn't like losing one of the last cases to China. But China, that being pointed out, is very culpable in a lot of the difficulties. Now, whether a Biden presidency will change this is going to be difficult. I think he believes in multilateral organizations. He'll try and reinvigorate NATO, the WTO, others reach out. But one thing that you see in Washington, D.C. is whether they're Republican or Democrats, dealing with China and the way that it's been behaving from their perspective is bipartisan. So basically, I think that Biden will try and make the WTO work, but they will be taking on China maybe more intelligently, and try and isolate it, try and push it in a direction that it's starting to do in some of the other areas in terms of technology, in terms of regulation and things like that. So we can hope that WTO is reinvigorated, because we need it to be able to mediate these problems.
Yeah.
There's a few questions now on financial services regulation. Obviously, that comes naturally, seeing the audience we have. So wondering thoughts from both of you on, firstly, do you think UK divergence from European financial markets regulation, is that good or bad for the City of London? Wider passporting discussions not seem to be going anywhere. And what do you think about the future role of the City of London within the EU when we exit?
Well, I think I'll leave John to answer more substantively. I'm sure he's more of an expert than I am. But clearly, the City of London is hugely important to the UK economy. It's the world's leading financial centre, in the best position from the point of view of the time zone and access to so many markets. And it's globally recognised as that. We've seen China using it as its main offshore base for renminbi, which of course is going to become more and more important. There hasn't been much talk about it in the negotiations that's been visible. And again, I can't comment on the negotiations, but everybody knows it's a critical issue. I'm sure it hasn't been forgotten. So, especially if we start to see positive movement in the FTA negotiations, I'm sure financial services will come back on the table, because the government is very well aware of what a critical issue this is. In terms of how we would do with a separate regime outside the EU, I'm not going to go on what the City of London and all the representative financial services associations say, which is that we're better off being part of the European system than out of it, although there may be some specific individual opportunities for certain subsectors if we were on our own. But I think we all agree that it would be better if we manage to get the passporting issues resolved and can remain properly connected with the EU. But I don't know, John, I'm sure you have more to say on this.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is that I've been doing consultancy on this, and companies have been relocating some staff into Dublin, Frankfurt, Paris, but the numbers are never the same as what was flagged in 2016, 2017. So they've gone and got pumped up their presence with the ECB in Frankfurt to get regulation and etc. But Dublin, Frankfurt, and Paris are not going to take over London's role. It's just not going to happen. Frankfurt, you see these people on BBC or ITV saying we're going to take more business. Now, there could be an issue about the euro issue in terms of the clearing houses and things like that. ECB is quite concerned about that one, because they don't want to have that in the hands of a jurisdiction that is not under its regulation, I suppose. But London will be the financial centre for a while yet. Frankfurt, Paris, any of those other ones not. And in terms of regulation, it's very difficult. You know, if you go to at the beginning of this capital markets union, which was kind of something towards London, and then we had Brexit and everything else, that's not really moved forward very much, and it needs to from a European perspective. And there's a lot of chat when you go to these groups about how we're going to pick the bones of London and everything else. But as far as I can see at the moment, that is not that's not sort of translated into reality. So in terms of passporting, I think that one's gone, isn't it, really? I'm not really sure that we would be able to get passporting. We're looking maybe at some kind of equivalence, but then equivalence will put us in a situation where we're very, very much dependent on the European Union because of the regulation there, that if there's a dispute, they can pull the plug at some stage. So that's something that needs to be negotiated. It's a pity, in a way, when we've seen quite a lot of the discussion straight after Brexit, that there possibly hasn't been enough concentration on a part of the economy that contributes so much. It doesn't come up quite a lot in any of the papers that you're reading. It's sort of anecdotal kind of stuff. And there's lobbies going over to Europe, but nothing can happen on the basis of what's been said in the trade talks, right? And we're not really seeing a lot of focus on financial services, or am I missing something?
Thank you. We've just got a few minutes left now. One question, everybody's favorite topic at the moment, which is the pandemic. So how has the pandemic in the last few months accelerated or changed what is going on in terms of trade negotiation? What with the individual companies' economies, what with blocking people from traveling to different countries, what with where the virus was reported to have come from, and particularly, you know, what we've talked about in terms of US-China and UK-EU. Has it changed much or accelerated much in terms of trade? Well,
obviously the virus has had a huge impact on the economy and individual trade and business. I mean, there's obviously been a hit to trading everywhere in the world as a result of this, and economic growth everywhere in the world. In terms of negotiating trade agreements, I think, you know, there's a team at the DIT which has continued to go ahead and negotiate all those agreements. They've been able to travel. Diplomats traveling are exempt from all these, you know, self-quarantine requirements and restrictions and so on. And a lot of it's been done virtually, so it hasn't actually affected the trade negotiations. And in terms of the EU FTA, I mean, obviously a lot of the Prime Minister's personal time has been taken up by the COVID crisis, but David Frost and his team and all the people around him have been totally focused on the EU FTA. So in terms of practical negotiations, I don't think there's been a huge difference, but obviously in terms of trade, and it does make it all the more important, given the damage done to the economy by COVID, that we get a positive deal out of the EU FTA negotiations.
Well, it's had an effect because quite a lot of resources up until January this year were going towards dealing with the Brexit issue, and we had contingency planning that had been in place that seems to have been ignored by the government and previous governments in terms of having the right equipment for hospitals, the right equipment for doctors. I mean, these are common knowledge that this whole process was kind of mismanaged because of the focus on other things, especially Brexit. So that's affected us. And plus, what else has affected us is that when you look around the world and how countries have dealt with this issue, how many deaths and how many infections have happened. If you look at where a lot of people who are on this call, a place like Singapore has had not so many. Other countries in Asia have dealt with this. And, you know, Germany has dealt with it. And, you know, we've got capabilities in this country to actually would in the past been able to deal with this issue. Because what we're looking at is our trading relationship, but our economy has been severely damaged by the fact that we've not had a track and trace system that's worth it. You know, it's not there in the way that the Germans had it. Now we can point to other countries like Spain and France who have had similar problems, but we've got some of the best scientists, some of the best medical people. We've got labs, university labs. These have not been utilized in the way that they needed to be. If we go into a second lockdown, which might be a possibility, that will do untold damage to the economy. So we're dealing with Brexit, we're dealing with COVID-19. Our trading position is going to be complicated, to say the least. So it has had a detrimental effect, particularly on this country, because when you look at the figures in Europe, we've had one of the biggest falls in our economy. And when you look at what I'm involved with institutes in Germany, and when you look what they were doing in the first 4 weeks, and also their regional hospitals, their regional authorities, they've got themselves up and running again. Yeah, there's going to be a second wave, but they're ready, and we're still not ready. We keep hearing about this all the time. So this is going to have a detrimental effect, because we're going to have to deal with that again. And unfortunately, we might have some more deaths and some, you know, more stretching of the NHS during the winter time. So I think that for us is a problem. And at some stage, I suppose we will look into these issues in more greater detail. But now it's just trying to handle that. And some other countries have just come out much better than we have. And we see with the United States, they have similar problems in dealing with this. So yeah, COVID-19 has been something, you know, I suppose a black swan event, really, in that sense.
Jordan, I see there's a question on Spain. Can I just answer that one?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and absolutely.
Yes, your question, what will our relationship with Spain be after the end of the transition period? Well, I was talking to our new Spanish country director for Department of International Trade in the embassy in Madrid on Friday. He's extremely positive about the opportunities for continued trade between Spain and the UK. As you say, Spain is one of our bigger European trading partners. We also have a number of significant Spanish investors in the UK, Santander, but also big construction companies, clothing companies, a lot of Spanish investors, and we've also got quite a lot invested in Spain, utilities both ways. And actually, the Spanish government is quite supportive of the UK. Hasn't been one of the more problematic partners in all the ups and downs of the current EU issues. They tend to be quite helpful, despite the fact that the Gibraltar issue is always lurking in the background. We have a positive relationship with Spain, and we see them as one of the most supportive governments. I was talking to our ambassador a month ago, and he was extremely optimistic. I mean, of course, it will all depend in terms of practical trade, what happens, whether or not we get an FTA. I mean, Spain is the destination for an awful lot of our food exports, you know, seafood, for example. So, you know, we don't want to be suddenly faced with massive tariffs on seafood and that kind of thing. Those are problems that will be, you know, this problem of tariffs, if we don't reach an agreement, is going to affect multiple sectors. So let's hope we do reach an agreement. But we're positive about the long-term political and trading relationship with Spain.
Thank you, Richard. That brings us up to 1 o'clock. So I think that's all we have time for this afternoon. I'm sorry to those that asked questions and we didn't have time to cover them. So just want to thank John and Richard for sharing their thoughts with us and spending their time with us this afternoon. If you'd like to find out more about Worshipful Company of International Bankers, please visit our website, and there you can find the contact details of our clerk, and through our clerk, feel free to get in touch with me, or indeed with John and Richard through that. So thank you very much for dialing in this afternoon, and have a good week.